Welcome to the very first Walks in the Wild vlog. I'm Steve Jones. Essentially these are going to be me walking around in nice kind of natural or wildlife rich at least landscapes like here on Ventnor Downs on the Isle of Wight. Walking around in these kind of places and talking about high nature value farming and rewilding, land sparing, land sharing, that kind of stuff. Biodiversity conservation basically within the UK but also internationally, particularly in the tropics, which is a subject that's very close to my heart. So this is Combe Bottom on the south coast of the Isle of Wight. Today's topic is going to be fairly timely given that in the last 2 or 3 weeks we've had a bit of an influx of red-backed shrikes, particularly in the northern England or north, and in Scotland and along the east coast, and a few down on the south coast, including one today found by Tracy Jolie from Brading Marshes, RSPB Nature Reserve, on the east of the island, a nice male red-backed shrike. And we're going to be talking about reintroduction of red-backed shrike. Should they be reintroduced or should we wait for them to recolonise naturally? That's what we're going to think about today. So just by way of an introduction to me, I kind of worked in UK conservation for about 20 years, for the RSPB for a decade or so, and other organisations, plant life, bug life, wildlife trusts, etc. And the Environment Agency, or National Rivers Authority all those years ago, working on river restoration. But I've primarily worked on species recovery, particularly farmland bird recovery, and larger scale habitat recreation, particularly river restoration and wetland restoration. And more lately I've worked quite a lot on species reintroductions, which is a subject I'm broadly supportive of under the right circumstances, and we'll quickly go over what I think the right circumstances are by considering the red-backed shrike in this particular video. So I think we're in fairly classic, or one version of fairly classic red-backed shrike habitat here, which is open grassy shrublands, which basically means a mosaic of widely scattered and small clumps of native thorny shrubs and other shrubs embedded within wildflower-rich native grasslands. This is owned by the National Trust, and to my eye it's perfect red-backed shrike habitat. You've got the structural component, which is areas of widely scattered native shrubs, things like wild rose and blackthorn and hawthorn, embedded within species-rich grassland, which is very rich in wildflowers. This is chalk grassland in this case, but also is an intricate mosaic of tussocky grasslands in some areas and tightly grazed grassland in other areas, and things like this, trackways with fence lines. So you can also get the right kind of structure for red-backed shrikes on more conventional farmland if it's low intensity, where you have hedgerow systems, which are the shrubby component surrounding mixed both grassland and arable fields. As long as both the grassland and the arable fields are species rich, they need to be rich in wildflowers. We'll come on to that in the second key attribute really. So that's the structural attribute, and the second key attribute for a really good red-backed shrike kind of landscape is lots and lots of big invertebrates. Red-backed shrikes have an inordinate fondness for beetles, don't we all? And particularly beetles associated with dung, particularly cattle dung it would seem. And so beetles are key, and they're obviously caught on the ground by red-backed shrikes, which is a sit and wait sort of hunter. So it will sit on a kind of a wire fence line like this and scan around and wait for a beetle to break cover from the tussocky grassland where there may be a cowpat and run across this open area, and then the red-backed shrike will glide down and land on the beetle and carry it back to the fence line and devour it, or take it back to the nest if it's got chicks and pull it apart and feed it to the chicks. So that's one component in terms of diet, are larger invertebrates, or larger beetles, and then larger bumblebees. They absolutely love bumblebees, and that's why your grassland really has to have lots and lots of wildflowers blooming throughout the kind of the nesting period for red-backed shrikes, which is kind of now onwards. We're in early June, late May, early June onwards. So they must have lots and lots of flowers because they love bumblebees and various sorts of bees and butterflies, but particularly bumblebees, it would seem. So beetles, bumblebees, larger species, and then also Orthoptera, so grasshoppers and bush crickets. That's where some of this tussocky grassland really comes into its own, and the shrubby components. You've got the common grasshoppers, and they just love common grasshoppers, the ones that used to be really common out on farmland, and bush crickets as well on the woody components of this habitat. So that's a very broad overview of what makes a decent red-backed shrike territory. Widely scattered thickets of shrubs, embedded within species-rich tussocky and tightly grazed grassland, and lots of bare ground as well, so I missed that component. So if you've got wild boar, all the better, because they'll be creating the areas of bare ground that red-backed shrikes absolutely adore, because accessibility of prey is all important. There's no good having loads and loads of prey if they can't actually see it. Being a sitting, scanning kind of hunter, they need bare ground and tightly grazed grassland in order to see their key prey items when they break cover. So why did we lose red-backed shrikes in the first place? Well, let's go back to the IUCN guidelines first. So that's the key kind of framework within which all species reintroductions should be considered. And the first absolutely key question really is, have you properly diagnosed why the species was lost from your area you're considering to reintroduce them to? And we've got a pretty good idea, I think, of why we lost red-backed shrikes. Let's just think about what I described in terms of their diet. So large invertebrates, beetles, bumblebees, odonata, dragonflies and damselflies, and Orthoptera, and some other smaller invertebrates as well, but they're the key ones, those four. And over the course of the loss of red-backed shrikes from the UK, we saw the intensification of farmland, so the application of organic fertilisers and inorganic fertilisers, and higher stocking rates of livestock, and the general intensification of arable systems as well, all of which are key elements of a really good red-backed shrike landscape. So those varieties of intensification will presumably, and I'm saying presumably because the actual data aren't very good, but presumably have led to a decline in key invertebrate groups that red-backed shrikes need. And there's been the general kind of tidying up of the countryside, the loss of shrubby grasslands like the ones we're walking through now, and the kind of the manicuring of hedgerows. So in terms of hedgerows, they love them rough and spilling out of the margins rather than tightly manicured. So I think we have a reasonably good idea of why we lost red-backed shrikes. Loss of larger invertebrates, or loss of abundance, not complete loss, but just a decline in the abundance of larger invertebrates, and a general simplification of the structure of UK farmland and northwest European farmland really, and increasingly these days Eastern European farmland as well, because of the Common Agricultural Policy. So back to the IUCN guidelines, if we properly diagnose the causes of the decline, which I think we have, we can think about, have we actually rectified the problem such that there's enough suitable habitat that can sustain a viable population of your species without long-term ongoing intervention, in enough kind of abundance to remain viable. And now I'd argue that in southern England, areas I'm familiar with, such as the Isle of Wight and parts of Sussex and Purbeck especially, I would argue there is enough habitat to support a few pairs of red-backed shrikes. And And places like the Knepp Estate in Sussex is, unquestionably, I think, really, really good quality red-backed shrike habitat, as are areas in Purbeck around the ranges and some of the National Trust land there. Lots of suitable red-backed shrike habitat on the Isle of Wight. So why are there no red-backed shrikes? So they declined in southern England, and the last remaining sort of pairs were on kind of heathy habitat and kind of a forested heath clearings in the New Forest and the sandlings in Suffolk, and in Suffolk and Breckland. So I think what was going on there was that those kind of heathy habitats, not necessarily the best red-backed shrike habitats, but just the ones that escaped the kind of agricultural intensification that was taking place across open farmland. So you effectively had red-backed shrikes declining and disappearing across southern England farmland. I'm talking about southern England because that's the area I'm most familiar with, and the lowlands, because again that's the area, the habitat type I'm most familiar with. So they declined on that open farmland, and what remained was basically confined to the habitat that didn't really face that kind of intensification over that period, which is the heathlands, the afforested heaths, places like the New Forest, although obviously that suffered quite a lot of decline in terms of invertebrate abundance, and the sandlings and Breckland. So they held on in those areas that may not have been prime habitat. They're pretty good, but doesn't mean that they are a heathland species. So what they are is a wider countryside species that needs big invertebrates and open grassy shrublands just like this. That can be on chalk, as we are here. We're actually on an acid kind of pebbly cap to the chalk on old Chalk Heath here, or arable reversion undertaken by the National Trust on area that was Chalk Heath. So chalk grassland, neutral grassland, floodplains, the upper slightly dry bits of floodplains, wetland areas. So they're not, red-backed shrike isn't particularly specialist in terms of the broad habitat. They just need grassy shrubland mosaics, and that can be early successional habitat, which this effectively is, because it's arable reversion undertaken by the National Trust probably about 20 years ago, that now is good red-backed shrike habitat because it's got lots of wildflowers and nice open views with patches of scrub. So I've argued that we do have at least some suitable habitat. I should mention Dartmoor as well, which is probably the last place in southern England where they successfully bred a few times. So a pair or two did turn up on Dartmoor, on open kind of moorland habitat in a scrubby area with kind of streams and tightly grazed acid grassland. And they nested there quite successfully for several years, and then they gradually petered out. And that's a good indicator of what the issue is with red-backed shrike in terms of natural recolonisation of those areas of suitable habitat we do actually have in the UK. Places like Knepp and here on the Isle of Wight and Purbeck and Dartmoor, etc. So we undoubtedly need a lot more of that kind of suitable habitat, but we also need the birds to be coming into the landscape in spring. They're obviously a migrant red-backed shrike. The interesting thing about red-backed shrike is if a pair of birds return to Dartmoor, say, that nested there the previous year, so if they return there this spring and if they'd nested there last spring or last summer, which they didn't, but if they did, and that pair that successfully nested last year came back, they'd probably head back to the same territory, and that's relatively higher breeding site fidelity or philopatry. So the successful breeders will return back into a territory they've occupied in previous years, assuming the habitat remains suitable. But then they will have chicks. Those chicks will migrate down into Africa. Some of them will survive, maybe. And those that return, they don't return to the natal site. They don't return back to the territory on the whole where they were born. They're quite dispersive, so they show lower natal site or low natal site philopatry. So high breeding philopatry, so the adults that have successfully bred will return back into the territory that they successfully bred in quite often, but low natal philopatry, so the birds they fledge won't return back into that territory. What you will get is mortality, obviously, so some of those adult birds are not going to survive. They're quite short-lived, but it generally isn't going to be ones that are fledged from within that territory that come back to occupy the territory. It'll be somebody else's chicks from another territory, probably within the same region, although I'm not sure how strong the evidence for that is. So in southern England and eastern England, by way of example, we have a situation where there simply aren't enough birds returning into potentially suitable habitat. What we tend to get is widely dispersed individuals that just aren't meeting up. This is speculative, but I think the evidence supports what I'm saying here. So for natural recolonisation of the kind of southern and eastern England to occur, or the southwest to occur, and for that to be sustained, what we really need for that to happen naturally is for the population on the near continent in northwest Europe to be doing well. And the second edition of the European Breeding Bird Atlas suggested some indications that that may well be what's happening. So in northern France and parts of Spain, Denmark and Holland, it does appear that the populations have started to increase again. And they're obviously doing habitat creation in those kind of regions as well. So juveniles born in those kind of regions in northern France are coming back in the spring and occupying newly created habitat. And there's some indication that they might be colonising abandoned farmland in some of the upland parts of Spain, I think. So kind of passive rewilding that's occurring may be creating perfect red-backed shrike habitat, because they love early successional grassy shrubland mosaics. But they do need the grazers in there, otherwise it won't last very long. It's an interesting Sylvia warbler singing over there. I wonder if you can hear it. I'll let you work out what it is. Anyway, back to red-backed shrikes. Can you hear that? So back to red-backed shrikes. So in theory, what we might see over the next decade, or what we need to watch for over the next decade, is for that habitat in northern France and Denmark and Holland and Spain to gradually become saturated. And as that happens, the likelihood of those juveniles that are showing low natal site philopatry, the likelihood of them drifting even further north and spilling into England and Scotland may well increase. We may see more birds in spring, as we have this spring. We've seen lots more birds this spring. I don't think that's any indication that we might be seeing the early stages of a recolonisation event, but you never know. So what I think the conservation community in southern England needs to do is to be on alert, keep an eye on the data. Are the numbers of red-backed shrikes arriving in southern England and eastern England and just in the UK in spring, are they gradually increasing? Somebody analyse bird reports or spring arrival data for red-backed shrike and see if there's any kind of trend, or whether it's just going down level or going up in terms of the number of migrants arriving in spring. Now, as well as keeping an eye on things, seeing what the trends are looking like in terms of numbers arriving in spring, we should also be creating more habitat for red-backed shrikes. And the great thing about that species is that it's kind of a really good ambassador species for a whole load of other wildlife that's some of which is of conservation concern and where we need to be doing stuff anyway. Species like cuckoo, turtle dove, adder, hedgehog, whole load of species, glowworms. There's a whole load of species that love open grassy shrubland mosaics that are very species rich, flower rich. I can't emphasise enough how important the flowering component is in that habitat. It's no good having grassy shrubland mosaics that don't have any wild flowers in them, because then you won't have the invertebrates in the numbers you need to support a lot of those species. And things like turtle doves and red-backed shrikes need the disturbed ground as well. So we already need wild boar back. But anyway, so let's anticipate that they will naturally recolonise, given they are gradually beginning to increase on the near continent. What we need to do, therefore, is create habitat for them, kind of a warm reception, by creating grassy shrubland mosaics. And luckily, it's a relatively straightforward habitat to create. I've written a little booklet on how to do it, which I'll put a link to that in the description to this video below. But essentially, if you have a big open field, say an arable field, as this field was before the National Trust turns it into nice habitat, if you've got a big arable field of a few hectares that you want to turn into a Shrike shrubland, as I've called it in the booklet. This is all set out how to do this in the booklet, very briefly. What I would do is basically establish widely scattered groups of thorny shrubs, such as wild field rose, dog rose, and also bramble, especially some gorse if it's on the right soils, more acidic soils, blackthorn and hawthorn, the odd crab apple, good vantage point. And then in the open components, in this case arable, in the example I'm describing here, I would use green hay to inoculate the site as quickly as possible. Make sure it's infertile as possible. So if it's quite a fertile arable field, it's got a legacy of fertiliser applications, then do some cropping, unfertilised barley cropping, harvest the crops, get everything off. Do that over a couple of years so you've depleted the soil nutrients to some extent, and then bring in green hay from species-rich sites and kind of inoculate patches. You don't need to spread the hay over the whole of the arable component. In fact, don't do that. Concentrate it in patches so you create kind of nuclei of species richness, wildflower richness, which will then spread out across the areas the habitat develops. Dig loads of clean water pools. So if it's a kind of an open arable field, then block any subsurface drainage there is, any old mole drains or anything similar to that. Any ceramic drains, block those so they stop working, to reignite spring lines, and dig clean water pools and scrapes, widely scattered. That will help turtle doves and red-backed shrikes, which obviously like the odonata, so they need that wetland component ideally. Not crucially, they will breed in dry shrubby habitats as well. In fact, most of them are probably in dry shrubby habitats. This sort of scraping here almost perfectly illustrates what red-backed shrikes like. Cattle dung for the dung beetles and other beetles, and bare ground with tussocky grassland nearby. Now, cattle grazing, I think, is absolutely crucial for a really good quality shrike shrubland, but it's really important that the cattle dung is clear of worming type chemicals, avermectins, etc., because you need the dung to be full of invertebrates, and if it's laced with chemicals, then it won't be full of the invertebrates. They'll try to lay their eggs, and the eggs will just be poisoned, and that's no good for red-backed shrikes. They need dung-associated invertebrates, which means the dung needs to be free of chemicals. So like I say, I have written a little booklet, a link to which is in the description to this video below, on how to create this kind of habitat. But to summarise, it's going to be full of wildflowers, widely scattered scrub, not big blocks of scrub, because that's no good for red-backed shrikes. They like them very widely scattered, small patches of scrub embedded within flower-rich grassland, which is a mosaic of tussocky and shortly grazed grassland and disturbed ground. So in terms of your grazing animals, you want cattle that are free of avermectin, so anti-parasitic drugs. You really want wild boar, or some sort of pigs if you don't want wild boar, and everyone should have wild boar. And some ponies or horses would be good as well. You can see what I'm describing here. It's kind of a NEP type situation. So we need to be doing lots of that. We need to be creating patches of a few hectares and more, so it can support a couple of pairs of red-backed shrikes or more. So that would be my priority, is to monitor the situation, are more birds arriving in spring, and create lots and lots of really nice open shrubby grassland mosaics that are full of wildflowers and clean dung. So should we just wait and see though? This is where we come on to the reintroduction question. So a couple of years ago I did an initial feasibility study on the reintroduction of red-backed shrikes to southern England on behalf of the RSPB and Natural England and the NEP estate, and that was essentially an initial literature review looking at the natural history and ecology of red-backed shrikes and their kind of dispersal and migration ecology, and looking at how you would actually go about undertaking a reintroduction. And what I kind of concluded there in terms of the actual methodology is you'd really replicate what you've done for loggerhead shrikes in the US over recent decades. So you would establish a captive population of red-backed shrikes, and we know they can be kept in captivity because people have done it in England, in the UK, and they've managed to breed them in captivity as well. So you would establish a population of adult birds in captivity that would be used to raise juveniles for subsequent release. Now, how could you establish a captive population as part of a conservation breeding programme? Well, you would find a receptor or a donor site or a landscape region somewhere on the near continent, and I think you would collect eggs, a whole clutch from selected nests, because the adults will quickly relay a whole clutch. And then you'd transport those eggs into the UK, into rearing facilities where you would essentially incubate the eggs, and you'd hand rear the broods, and then you would have your captive group of red-backed shrikes, 20, 30 pairs maybe, so 20, 30 aviaries. Like I say, you'd largely replicate the kind of the aviary design and methodologies applied successfully to loggerhead shrikes, which are ecologically quite reasonably similar. Then at fledging time, I'd suggest you'd transport those birds ready to fledge, the juveniles, into the release landscape, which might look something like this. This is Coombe Bottom on the Isle of Wight, but just one of those grassy shrubland mosaics that's suitable habitat. You would fledge them into that habitat from aviaries at an appropriate time, so you'd probably hold them in release aviaries for a week or so, and you would release them. They would effectively fledge out into that landscape, which would be full of larger invertebrates for them. They'd learn how to find food, and then they'd migrate. They'd head south, and then a proportion of them, or a certain percentage of them, would return the following spring. And as I said, they seem to display low natal site philopatry, so low site fidelity. So what you would need to assume is that those birds wouldn't return to the release site necessarily. One or two might do, and you might do some luring, some singing male songs to lure a few back in, but generally I think you should assume that they wouldn't necessarily return to the release site. They would return to the region though. They'd return to southern England, probably quite close to the release site, within a few kilometres. And you would need to release quite a lot, because the probability of them actually surviving the migration would be not that high. I mean, clearly they do survive on migration because they've been doing it for an awful long time, and there's, so you would need to release quite a few each spring, each late summer, so that you've got a reasonable number returning the following spring and spring subsequently, and there would need to be enough returning to pair up, and the pairs would be formed both by the birds that were released the previous fledging time and other birds that are just spilling up from the near continent. Obviously some of the birds you release in southern England, say, would probably recruit into territories in France and the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe. So you'd lose a few. You'd get some leakage, as they say. You'd need to continue this. Well, 2 points. You'd need to continue it for quite a while, probably over, each year for 7 years, maybe a decade, to build up a viable population. And you would need to release a lot each year, I think. So I said 20 to 30 pairs in a conservation breeding programme. Really, you need as many as you can. It would be at least 20 to 30 pairs, probably, well, ideally more than that, I would have said, just to produce enough chicks to release each spring, or each fledging time, so late summer. And that's how you might undertake a conservation breeding and rear and release components. So adult birds in aviaries would rear their own chicks, and then you would fledge those chicks into a suitable release landscape and keep the adults. You might release a few adults because it may be useful for them to teach the chicks how to forage, but I'm not sure whether that's true or not. Something that would need to be part of the kind of the experimental component of your project, your reintroduction project. And concurrently, leading up to that process, so from now onwards, you need to create as much habitat as you can. So get hold of a copy of my little booklet and create as much shrike shrubland habitat as you possibly can, because it's a no-regret habitat. It supports so much wildlife anyway, including species that urgently need conservation action or need more conservation action. So we're just beginning to do stuff for cuckoos. We're doing stuff for turtle doves, linnets, hedgehogs, glowworms. Those sorts of things love exactly the sort of shrike shrubland type habitat. Any woodland creation projects should be creating shrike shrublands as the early succession or the early years of a subsequent woodland. It's one thing about red-backed shrikes. I think they really are a specialist of early successional habitats, which is, I think, is why one of the reasons why the youngsters have low natal site philopatry. They just move around the landscape with the habitat as it develops, and as it over matures, then there's, back in the day there would be new shrubland habitats, because I think European wooded landscapes would have been quite dynamic, and there'd be new patches of open shrubby habitats developing across a region each year. And that's what these shrikes would be following around over the years. Back down in Coombe Bottom now. So I suppose I should address a question: what do I think we should actually do? Should we try and reintroduce them, or should we focus purely on habitat creation in the anticipation that if you create the habitat, they will come? So generally speaking, I'm in favour of species reintroductions where the IUCN kind of criteria are met. So where you properly diagnose the cause of the decline, where you've rectified the problems the species face, such that the area you're thinking of reintroducing them into is suitable, can support a long-term viable population without intensive directed human intervention. And if you've done that, then I think species reintroductions is in principle a good idea for a given species. So I think it was a good idea for white-tailed eagle. I think it would be a good idea maybe for cell bunting on the Isle of Wight, although I'll do another video on that. What about red-backed shrike though? I'm on the fence, to be honest. So like any good shrike, I'm kind of sitting and waiting. So I think we should double down on habitat creation. So we should be creating shrike shrublands as much as possible in anticipation of them colonising naturally. But I also think if the resources are available, that we should probably attempt to reintroduce them as well. And I'm not entirely sure. Like I said, I did an early kind of the first stage of a feasibility study for the RSPB, Natural England and the NEP estate. And that revealed how tricky the species actually might be because of that low natal site philometry. The issue being that in spring you just, not enough might return in the spring to actually pair up, even if you've got the suitable habitat. And that may be a problem in the longer term if the birds, if you don't attempt a reintroduction and there aren't enough red-backed shrikes arriving in spring in suitable habitat in sufficient numbers that they actually find each other and pair up, then they may never recolonise. But if there are enough birds, if they're having decent breeding success on the near continent, then intrinsically I think they have fairly high capacity to naturally recolonise, just because they're quite a mobile species that likes early successional shrubland habitat. They also love this kind of habitat, which definitely isn't early successional, in a sense that it's really old chalk grass and it's been like this for hundreds of years. So it's kind of a static early successional habitat that's kept this way by conservation management. But they equally like genuinely early successional habitat that's dynamic and is gradually moving towards being close canopy woodland. The very early stages of that, the first 20, 30 years maybe, as long as it has those key elements, the structure and the large invertebrates, beetles, bumblebees, dragonflies, damselflies and grasshoppers and bush crickets. As long as they're there, then a suitable habitat. So tell me in the comments section what you think. Should we attempt to reintroduce red-backed shrikes, or should we adopt a kind of a wait and see shrikey type approach where we create the habitat, which I think is non-negotiable. We have to do that because so many other species will benefit anyway. And do we just wait and see if they manage to recolonise the habitat? Let me know in the comments section. I hope you enjoyed the video. It's nice making it. This is the first walk in the wild kind of a vlog that I'm going to do, and I'll be doing one on cell bunting reintroduction soon. Probably do a shorter one on white-tailed eagles, because obviously they were reintroduced to the Isle of Wight, or the Isle of Wight was used as a launch pad for them anyway. So yeah, give me your views in the comments section. Subscribe to this channel if you've not already done so. If you like the video, you can make a donation by pressing the thanks button next to the video or down below the video. That will just take you to an area where you can make a donation to support my video content creation endeavours. And now I'm going to head back down into Ventnor Bay and grab a cup of coffee. So thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next of these videos.